It's Dr. Naim Tahir Baig. Welcome to my channel.
Good day. Today, I want to walk you through one of the most consequential military operations of our time, and one of the clearest case studies in strategic failure that the modern era has produced. On the 28th of February, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a coordinated campaign against Iran. The Americans called it Operation Epic Fury. The Israelis called it Roaring Lion. Within hours, Iran's supreme leader was dead, its air defenses were in ruins, and a region home to 400 million people had been plunged into open war. This is the story of how that happened, and more importantly, why it went so wrong, so fast. One thing I want to make explicit before we begin. This analysis reflects the factual record as of early March 2026, the war's first 6 days. The conflict is ongoing as I record this, and many of the figures I'll cite were still being verified at the time of writing. I see that as a strength, not a weakness, of this kind of analysis. So throughout, I'll be clear about what was firmly known and what was still contested, and I'll show you the competing estimates rather than pretending to a false precision. With that understood, let's begin. Let me set the scene. It is just after 2 in the morning, Eastern Time. Across 5 Iranian cities, Tehran, Isfahan, Karaj, and Kermanshah, the sky fills with American and Israeli aircraft and missiles. In the first 12 hours alone, U.S. Central Command conducts more than 900 strikes. The Israeli Air Force flies its largest sortie in history. The stated goals were breathtaking in their ambition: destroy Iran's nuclear and missile programs, eliminate the regime's leadership, and trigger a popular revolution that would topple the Islamic Republic from within. By the third day, the picture looked very different from the one the public had been sold. The Strait of Hormuz, the artery through which a fifth of the world's oil flows, was effectively closed. 6 American service members were dead. U.S. embassies across the Gulf had been struck by Iranian missiles. Thousands of flights were cancelled. The war had escaped its intended parameters before the first week was even out. Keep those 3 numbers in mind: 900 strikes, 20% of the world's oil halted, 6 Americans dead in 72 hours, because they frame everything that follows. And stay with me through the diplomatic story that opens this analysis, because to understand how 6 young Americans came to die with no warning and no siren, and how, in the chaos, Allied aircraft were shot out of the sky by friendly fire, you first have to understand the choices that made all of it almost inevitable. Few operations in the post-Cold War era were launched with such confident rhetoric. Central Command itself boasted that this was, and I'm quoting, the largest regional concentration of American firepower in a generation. And yet, for all that firepower, one thing was conspicuously absent: a clear theory of victory. When the president was asked how long the operation would last, he told one newspaper 4 weeks or less, and another 4 to 5 weeks. The Secretary of State said, simply, "I don't know how long it will take." The Defense Secretary offered no timeline at all. When the people running a war cannot agree on what winning looks like or when it ends, that is not a detail, that is the central problem. Even the codenames told a story. Roaring Lion, Epic Fury, loud, forceful, unleashed, but saying nothing about an endpoint. In this analysis, I'm going to identify 7 distinct categories of strategic error, and then the single underlying pathology that ties them all together. Let's begin. Here is the architecture of the failure, laid out in full. 7 miscalculations. 1. The failure of diplomatic sequencing, negotiating while already preparing to strike. 2. Flawed intelligence assumptions, with unmistakable echoes of Iraq in 2003. 3. The decapitation fallacy, the belief that killing a leader causes a state to collapse. 4. The dramatic underestimation of regional escalation. 5. The catastrophic miscalculation over the Strait of Hormuz. 6. Constitutional and legal overreach at home. And 7, perhaps the deepest of all, the complete absence of any credible plan for what comes after military victory. I'll take each in turn, and I'll show you the evidence behind every one. To be clear about how this fits together, there are 7 categories of error, which I'll score across 10 distinct dimensions at the very end of the analysis. None of these errors required secret intelligence to anticipate. That is what makes this case so instructive, and so troubling. We start with diplomacy, because the war's first and arguably most consequential mistake was made long before the first bomb fell. Beginning in April of 2025, the United States and Iran held several rounds of indirect nuclear talks, mediated by Oman, in Rome, Geneva, and Muscat. On paper, this looks like genuine diplomacy. In practice, it was something else entirely. The Trump administration framed these negotiations not as an open search for an agreement, but as a structured ultimatum. Iran was told it must dismantle its nuclear program entirely, cut its missiles down to short-range systems only, and sever its regional alliances, or face military action. Now, consider those terms from Tehran's perspective. These were demands that no sovereign state had ever accepted under comparable circumstances. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, made the position clear. The Islamic Republic would not capitulate to what he called peace by subjugation. The administration's own rhetoric made things worse. The Secretary of State publicly doubted whether any deal was even possible. The Vice President expressed frustration that the Supreme Leader himself wasn't attending the talks, a striking misunderstanding of how Iranian political structures actually work. A fourth round of talks was scheduled for Vienna. It was never held. The decision to strike had effectively been made before the diplomatic track was ever exhausted. When you treat negotiation as a box to be ticked before a war you've already chosen, you don't get peace. You get a paper trail. And there's a further dimension here that's easy to miss. When Britain, France, and Germany triggered the so-called snapback sanctions in October of 2025, reimposing the penalties suspended under the 2015 nuclear deal, the agreement known as the JCPOA, they intensified the pressure on Tehran enormously. But in doing so, they also reduced Iran's incentive to compromise. If the full weight of sanctions is already crashing down regardless of what you do at the table, then what exactly are you bargaining for? Pressure applied without a credible path to relief doesn't produce concessions. It produces fatalism, and a fatalistic adversary is one that has stopped calculating the costs of confrontation. Let me lay the road to war out in sequence, because the chronology matters. In March of 2025, the president sent a letter to the Supreme Leader, warning of serious military consequences. In April, the indirect talks began, and immediately stalled over the US demand for full dismantlement. In October, Britain, France, and Germany triggered the snapback sanctions, reimposing the full weight of international economic pressure. Then the situation inside Iran began to unravel. In December, nationwide protests erupted across all 31 provinces, the largest since the 1979 revolution. In January of 2026, the state's response turned to mass killing, even as the United States deployed 2 aircraft carrier groups to the region. By the 17th of February, at talks in Geneva, the Supreme Leader was threatening to sink American warships, and Iran partially closed the Strait of Hormuz as a warning. On the 24th, the president used his State of the Union address to accuse Iran of reviving its nuclear weapons program, framing that analysts immediately compared to the WMD claims of 2003. And on the 28th, Operation Epic Fury commenced. The Supreme Leader was killed within hours. Every off-ramp had been bypassed. To understand why diplomacy collapsed, you have to understand the pressure cooker that Iran had become. This chart shows the estimated death toll from the protests, and the range is staggering, because the methodologies and the access differ so wildly. Iran's own government admitted to roughly 3,000. The Oslo-based Iran Human Rights Group put the minimum at around 3,400. The independent monitoring organization HRANA confirmed over 7,000, with thousands more under review. The United Nations Special Rapporteur estimated more than 20,000, and leaked Internal Health Ministry data, reported by Time and The Guardian, suggested a figure as high as 36,500. Whatever the true number, the strategic point is this: by early 2026, Iran was a state whose economy had collapsed, whose currency was in freefall, and whose people were in open revolt. From Tehran's vantage point, it had very little left to lose. Washington read that desperation as leverage, as a sign that Iran was weak and would fold. That was precisely the wrong reading. Desperation is not the same as weakness. A cornered state is often the most dangerous kind. Now, before I go further, I want to do something I think every honest analysis owes its audience. Let me give the operation's defenders their strongest argument, in their own voice, as fairly as I can put it, because if I only knock down a weak version of their case, I haven't really earned my conclusion. Here is how a serious supporter of Operation Epic Fury would frame it. Iran, they would say, was enriching uranium and had repeatedly stonewalled inspectors. 4 rounds of talks had visibly, demonstrably failed. You watched them collapse in real time. The regime had just murdered thousands of its own people in the streets, Even the most conservative count runs to over 3,000, and the highest credible estimates reach toward 36,000. This, they would argue, is a regime that respects nothing but force. And every month you wait, they would say, is a month closer to a nuclear-armed Iran, at which point military options vanish forever and you are negotiating with a state that can end cities. From that vantage point, acting decisively while you still could wasn't recklessness. It was responsibility. Better a hard war now than an impossible one later. That is a real argument, made by serious people, and it deserves to be taken seriously. So why does this paper still conclude that the costs outweighed it? For 3 reasons that the evidence forces upon us. First, the central premise turned out to be shaky. The very intelligence assessments inside the administration judged the long-range missile threat unfounded, and the international inspectors found no indication the nuclear sites had even been hit. Second, the defender's own goal, a less dangerous Iran, was made less likely, not more, by an operation that has unified Iranians against a foreign aggressor and risks scattering nuclear material across competing factions. And third, the case for striking now rested on the claim that diplomacy was exhausted, but as we've seen, the 4th round was never even held. The strongest argument for the war, in other words, depended on facts that the war itself disproved. Hold on to that, because it is the thread running through everything that follows. Which brings us to the second miscalculation, and to a ghost that has haunted American foreign policy for over 2 decades. In his State of the Union address, the president made 2 central claims. First, that Iran was reviving its efforts to build nuclear weapons. And second, that Iran had developed missiles that could threaten Europe and American bases, and was working on missiles that would soon reach the United States itself. For anyone who lived through 2003, the structure of these claims was painfully familiar. This was the architecture of the Iraqi weapons of mass destruction case, rebuilt almost beam for beam. But here is where it becomes damning. American intelligence assessments, circulated within the administration itself, judged that Iran's supposed long-range missile capability was, and I quote, unfounded. Such a capability, if Iran even chose to pursue it, would not exist before roughly 2035. And the International Atomic Energy Agency reported, as of the 2nd of March, that it had no indication that any nuclear installation had been hit or damaged in the strikes, which directly undercut the entire stated rationale for the war. The selective presentation of intelligence to justify a war that has already been decided upon is one of the most dangerous pathologies in any democracy. The lesson of this case is sobering. 18 years after Iraq, the institutional safeguards against that pathology remain dangerously inadequate. The administration had a counter-argument, and it leaned on it heavily. Officials pointed to the 2020 assassination of the Iranian General Qasem Soleimani as proof that you could carry out a decisive, targeted strike without triggering uncontrollable escalation. We killed the #1 terrorist in the world, the president said, and it should have been done 20 years ago. But this historical lesson was profoundly misread. Look closely at 2020. Iran did respond to Soleimani's killing, but with carefully calibrated strikes on an airbase in Iraq, and crucially, it gave advance warning through intermediaries so American forces could take cover. It was a face-saving response designed to avoid a wider war. The situation in 2026 was qualitatively different. The United States and Israel had not killed a single commander. They had decapitated the entire state apparatus, up to and including the supreme leader himself. There was no calibrated, face-saving response available in that scenario. The threshold for restraint simply did not exist. To reason from 2020 to 2026 was to compare a controlled demolition to burning down the building. This leads us directly to the third and perhaps most seductive error of the entire campaign, the decapitation fallacy. The opening strikes included a leadership decapitation campaign of a scale without precedent in modern warfare. Let me give you the numbers. In the first 12 hours, U.S. Central Command conducted more than 900 strikes. Israel deployed roughly 200 aircraft, its largest single sortie ever, hitting nearly 500 targets on day 1 alone. In the first 72 hours, at least 10 Iranian warships were sunk or hit. And the human toll at the top of the regime was extraordinary. The supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, was killed when his compound in Tehran was destroyed. So was the defense minister. So was the chief of the Revolutionary Guard Corps, along with senior members of the Security Council. The Israeli military announced that the top security leadership of the Iranian regime had been eliminated. The Israeli Prime Minister declared the operation would usher in an era of peace and let Iran's citizens form their own democratically elected government. It was, by any tactical measure, a stunningly executed strike. And it rested on a theory that a century of evidence tells us is simply false. Here is the theory the decapitation campaign relied upon: that if you eliminate a state's leadership, the population will rise up, seize the moment of the power vacuum, and overthrow the apparatus of the state. It is an appealing idea. It is also, historically, wrong. As analysts at the Stimson Center, a non-partisan security think tank, observed within hours of the strikes, what strategic bombing campaigns have reliably produced, across a century of evidence, is not rebellion but solidarity. Even populations that despise their own governments tend to close ranks against an external aggressor. It is one of the most consistent patterns in the entire study of war. The bombing of Dresden did not break German morale. The carpet bombing of North Korea did not produce surrender. The shock and awe campaign in Iraq did not generate the welcome its architects predicted. There was no analytical reason to believe Iran would be the exception. And what did the decapitation actually produce? A power vacuum at the worst possible moment. Iranian military commanders, suddenly freed from a paralyzed central command, activated pre-planned retaliatory contingencies. Iran's Operation True Promise 4 was launched within hours. In other words, the very success of the assassination campaign accelerated exactly the regional escalation the United States claimed it was trying to contain. And that regional escalation is our fourth miscalculation, the systematic underestimation of how far, and how fast, this war would spread. American planners appear to have assumed that Iran would keep its retaliation proportionate and bounded, that regime survival would remain its overriding priority, just as it had in 2020 and in the brief 12-day conflict of June 2025. That assumption collapsed within hours. Look at this map of the theater. Iran launched missiles and drones against Israel, against US bases across the Gulf, and against civilian infrastructure throughout the region. In Dubai, the Fairmont Hotel on the Palm was struck. Dubai International Airport was hit. Iranian missiles targeted the US Embassy compound in Kuwait and military installations across Qatar, Bahrain, and the Emirates. Central Command confirmed that Iran launched attacks against 27 American bases across the region. The Revolutionary Guard declared the Strait of Hormuz closed. Hezbollah fired rockets into northern Israel, drawing Israeli counter-strikes onto Beirut. By day 3, simultaneous military operations were underway across Tehran, Beirut, the Bekaa Valley, the Persian Gulf, and the airspace of multiple Gulf states. In all, 9 countries were struck within 72 hours. This was no longer a strike on Iran. It was a regional war, precisely the regional war the Supreme Leader had warned of in the days before his death. The tragedy is that his warning was treated as a bluff, right up until the moment it became a battlefield. This chart breaks down the Iranian missile barrage on the first day, using data from JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security of America, a pro-Israel defense policy group. Israel absorbed around 162 missiles. The Emirates, around 167. Qatar, 46. Kuwait and the other Gulf states, around 40. I'd flag that these are preliminary, day 1 figures, not a final tally, and remember, Iran also struck Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Cyprus, and Lebanon. Now, here is the strategic irony, and it cuts in 2 directions. Iran's decision to strike the Gulf states was, in itself, a serious miscalculation by Tehran. These were countries that had explicitly tried to stay out of the conflict. By attacking them, Iran handed the United States a coalition it might otherwise never have built. But, and this is the crucial point for our analysis, the American failure to anticipate that Iran might make exactly this miscalculation, thereby dragging unwilling parties into the war, was itself a failure of strategic imagination. Good planning doesn't just account for what your adversary should rationally do. It accounts for what a cornered, leaderless, furious adversary might actually do. And the cost to the Gulf states themselves deserves a moment. Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and Oman had been explicit in wanting to stay out. They had refused American requests to use their territory, and they had worked hard to prevent exactly this escalation. Oman's foreign minister, who had mediated the nuclear talks, said he was dismayed that the negotiations he'd nurtured were being undermined. Turkey launched an emergency ceasefire push. And in a single weekend, the entire architecture of regional diplomacy built over the preceding year was destroyed. Reluctant bystanders had been turned into targets, and into participants in a war none of them wanted. Let me bring this down from the strategic to the human, because this is where the cost became undeniable to the American public. This chart tracks US casualties over the first 3 days. On day 1, none. By day 2, 3 killed and 5 seriously wounded. By day 3, 6 killed and 18 wounded. Those 6 deaths came from a single event. A direct Iranian strike on a tactical operations center at Port Shuaibah, in Kuwait. No warning, no siren. Among the dead were a 39-year-old specialist and a 20-year-old sergeant, both from a sustainment command based in Iowa. And there was a second, almost surreal tragedy. In the chaos of active combat, 3 American F-15E Strike Eagle jets were mistakenly shot down by Kuwaiti air defenses, by an ally. All 6 aircrew managed to eject and were recovered alive, but think about what that tells you. The skies over the Gulf had become so saturated, so confused, that friendly forces were firing on friendly forces. This is what escalation looks like in practice. It is not orderly, it is not controlled, it is fog and noise and dead young people. Now we come to what may be the single most foreseeable miscalculation of the entire war, and the one with the widest consequences. The Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz, at its narrowest, is just 21 miles wide. And through that narrow channel flows the lifeblood of the global economy. Roughly 20 million barrels of oil transit it every single day, about 20% of the entire world's petroleum consumption. Some 22% of the world's liquefied natural gas passes through it as well, much of it from Qatar. Within hours of the strikes, the Revolutionary Guard began issuing warnings over the radio to vessels in the strait. No ship is allowed to pass. Major insurers suspended coverage for tankers. By the morning of the 2nd of March, a Revolutionary Guard commander officially declared the strait closed. And the markets reacted exactly as you would expect. Vessel tracking data showed traffic falling to near zero. More than 150 tankers anchored in open Gulf waters, waiting. And freight rates for the largest crude carriers surged 94% in a single trading session, an all-time record. The economic weapon that Washington appears to have forgotten was now pointed directly at the global economy. This chart shows what happened to oil prices. Brent crude jumped roughly 13%, from under $70 a barrel to over $80, and West Texas Intermediate followed it upward. I want to be precise about one number on this chart. The figure above $100 a barrel is not a price anyone actually paid, it is an analyst forecast of where prices would go if the closure persisted. So treat the early days as observed fact, and that $100 mark as a projection of the road the market feared it was on. As the head of Iran work at the International Crisis Group, the conflict prevention organization that had been close to the talks, put it, closing the strait would disrupt roughly a fifth of globally traded oil overnight, and prices would not just spike, they would gap violently upward on fear alone. The shock would reverberate far beyond energy. It would tighten financial conditions, fuel inflation, and push fragile economies toward recession in a matter of weeks. And here lies a geopolitical complication the planners seem not to have fully weighed. China relies on the strait for roughly half of all its crude imports. 84% of the oil transients the strait flows to Asia. So an operation aimed at Iran landed its heaviest economic blow on Beijing, New Delhi, Tokyo, and Seoul, enormously complicating any American effort to manage China's response to the war. The states with the spare capacity to ease the shock, Saudi Arabia and the Emirates, were themselves under Iranian missile fire and could not even guarantee safe passage for their own exports. And I want to be absolutely clear about something, because it is central to the entire argument of this paper. None of this was unforeseeable. For years, the Congressional Research Service had catalogued Iran's capacity to disrupt this waterway, its stockpiles of naval mines, its short-range missiles capable of targeting tankers. Iranian officials had threatened to close the strait, openly and repeatedly, across 2 decades. And just weeks before the war, in February of 2026, Iran had already conducted a warning drill and partially closed the strait. So the decision to launch a campaign of this magnitude without an adequate plan to protect commercial shipping, and without a plan to manage the economic fallout of a closure, was not a failure of information. The information was all there, in the public domain. It was a failure of integration, the unwillingness, or the inability, to allow well-known facts to actually constrain the military option that had already been chosen. Remember that distinction. We will return to it at the very end. Our 6th miscalculation moves from the battlefield to the home front, to the constitutional and legal foundations of the war itself. The legal foundations of Operation Epic Fury were contested from the very first hour. Under the United States Constitution, the power to declare war rests with Congress. No such declaration was sought. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 requires the President to notify Congress within 48 hours of committing forces to hostilities. The administration moved unilaterally, briefing congressional leadership only after the strikes had already begun. The reaction was sharp and bipartisan in its unease. The Senate Minority Leader, emerging from a classified briefing, called the administration's answers completely and totally insufficient, saying the briefing raised far more questions than it answered. The legal scholars were even more categorical. A senior advisor at the International Crisis Group stated flatly that there was no plausible legal justification for the attack, that Congress had not authorized it and the President was not repelling any sudden attack on the United States. The European Council on Foreign Relations called it an illegal war of choice. A group of international legal scholars convened by Just Security concluded that the strikes represented a tipping point for the United Nations Charter. And America's European allies, reportedly informed only minutes before the strikes, found themselves diplomatically blindsided, their ability to shape events destroyed from the outset. And so we arrive at the seventh and, in my judgment, the deepest miscalculation of them all. The one that received the least scrutiny in the heat of combat, and that may prove the most disabling of all. It is the complete absence of any credible political theory of what follows military success. The Israeli Prime Minister assured the world the operation would produce democracy in Iran. The American president told the Iranian people to take back their country. These were not plans, they were wishes. The historical record offers no support for those wishes. Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq. In each case, removing a state's governing structure produced not a democratic transition, but a power vacuum, filled by competing factions, by external actors, and by years of violence. And Iran is not a failed state waiting to be reborn. It is one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth, a nation of 90 million people, with a sophisticated educated class and a deeply complex internal political landscape. The notion that killing its supreme leader and shattering its command structure would produce a calm, orderly transition to liberal democracy reflects an extraordinary poverty of historical imagination. The supreme leader had named no successor. The most likely outcome of his death is not democracy, but a violent internal power struggle among Revolutionary Guard factions, hardline clerics, and what remains of the reformist networks. And worst of all, the very real concern that Iran's nuclear material, possibly including partially enriched stockpiles, could fall into the hands of competing factions amid the chaos. In the name of preventing a nuclear-armed Iran, the operation may have created the conditions for loose nuclear material in a collapsing state. That is the worst possible outcome from a non-proliferation standpoint. Beyond those 7 categories, there was a further dimension worth noting, a domestic political failure, because it shows how quickly the ground can shift under a war's architects. Back in May of 2025, a poll showed 57% of Americans supported striking Iran. But that figure reflected a public that was largely unaware of the full strategic costs. By the third day of actual combat, the picture had changed dramatically. Thousands of Americans were demonstrating in Boston, New York, Chicago, Portland, and Madison, chanting "Hands off Iran." Senate Republicans, normally reliable allies, were expressing open unease. Even one of Washington's most hawkish voices conceded that there was no simple answer for what would come next. And the administration's shifting public rationale compounded the damage. The war was first framed as eliminating an imminent threat. Then it was described as joining an Israeli operation. These narratives were inconsistent with one another, and inconsistent with a factual record that showed a military build-up planned over weeks, not a response to any specific, imminent act of aggression. Once again, the parallel to the shifting justifications of 2003 was unmistakable to critics across the political spectrum. So we have catalogued the errors. But here is the question that really matters. Why do these miscalculations cluster together? Why do they appear, again and again, in the same patterns? Because these were not merely individual lapses of judgment. They constitute a recognizable syndrome. Scholars have a name for it: strategic narcissism. It is the tendency to assess an adversary's likely behavior primarily through the lens of your own interests, your own capabilities, and your own assumptions, rather than through that adversary's own history, doctrine, and constraints. Think about what Washington already knew. Iran's entire strategic doctrine, built over 4 decades, rested on asymmetric deterrence, on proxy networks, on the weaponization of maritime choke points. The Revolutionary Guard's ability to threaten the Strait of Hormuz was thoroughly documented. Hezbollah's commitment to respond to an existential attack on Iran was a matter of public record. Iraqi militias had said openly they would not stay neutral. The Houthis had already shown their willingness to strike regional shipping. None of this required classified intelligence. All of it was public. And that points to a second pathology, which we might call planning tunnel vision. The American military optimized brilliantly for the tactical problem, suppressing air defenses, degrading command and control, executing precision strikes. But it maintained nothing like the same rigor around modeling strategic consequences. The sophistication of the opening hours stands in painful contrast to the poverty of the escalation modeling. The failure, once again, was not of information. It was of integration. Let me try to make this concrete with an analytical scorecard. I've taken each of the major miscalculations and scored its severity on a scale of 1 to 5, where 5 represents a critical strategic failure. This radar chart shows the result. Let me read the scores the way the chart lays them out, axis by axis. Diplomatic failure, a 5. Decapitation, a 5. Regional escalation, a 5. The Strait of Hormuz, a 5. Post-conflict planning, a 5. Then the 4s, intelligence errors, a 4, legal and constitutional overreach, a 4, and the historical misreading, chiefly the Soleimani precedent, a 4. The one that scores lower is domestic support, at a 3, because public opinion is more recoverable than a closed strait or a deadhead of state. One note, the paper's underlying table splits intelligence into 2 separate 4-rated rows, which is how it reaches 10 dimensions in total. The chart combines them into one intelligence axis, so if you count 9 spokes but here 10 dimensions, that's why. Add it up, and 7 of the 10 miscalculations score a 4 or a 5, major errors or outright critical failures. When you see a pattern this consistent, across this many independent dimensions, you are no longer looking at bad luck or the ordinary fog of war. You are looking at a systemic failure of strategic reasoning. So let me draw this together. As of the writing of this analysis, the war was entering its 6th day. The Strait of Hormuz remained effectively closed. Global energy markets were in sustained disruption. 6 American service members were confirmed dead, and 18 more seriously wounded. Iranian strikes had hit Gulf states whose neutrality Washington had simply assumed. Beirut was again under bombardment. Americans were being urged to evacuate more than a dozen countries. The stock market had fallen. Global inflation fears were intensifying. And Iran, battered, leaderless, but unbroken, showed no sign whatsoever of collapsing. Examined individually, each of these errors might be excused by the fog of war, by imperfect intelligence, by the honest miscalibration of an adversary's resolve. But examined together, they form an unmistakable pattern: the overestimation of air power's political utility, the underestimation of an adversary's capacity for rational, asymmetric response, the substitution of coercive ultimatums for genuine diplomacy, the abandonment of legal and constitutional norms in the rush to act, and the complete neglect of any post-conflict framework. These are the classic ingredients of strategic failure. And consider what was foregone. Iran in early 2026 was a state under extraordinary internal strain, economy collapsing, people in revolt, government internationally isolated. A patient strategy of sustained pressure, genuine diplomacy, and support for Iranian civil society offered a plausible path toward exactly the transformation the United States claimed to want. Operation Epic Fury has not made that transformation more likely. It has almost certainly made it harder, by unifying Iranians around resistance to a foreign aggressor, by destroying the institutional capacity for any ordered transition, and by generating a regional war whose full consequences no analyst is yet equipped to predict. As the Stimson Center put it, no matter how precise or devastating, airstrikes alone cannot topple a government. Iran in 2026 is likely to emerge battered but not broken, a costly example of American hubris and the limits of air power. The full strategic reckoning for this war has not yet begun. When it does, I do not believe it will be kind. Thank you for spending this time with me. If you found this analysis valuable, I'd ask you to subscribe to the channel, to share this video with anyone trying to make sense of these events, and to leave your own thoughts in the comments below. I read them, and the best discussions on this channel happen there. My work draws on assessments from the Stimson Center, the Atlantic Council, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Washington Institute, the International Crisis Group, the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the public reporting of news organizations around the world. You'll find the full source list in the description. I'm Dr. Naim Tahir Baig. Until next time, keep thinking critically, and never accept the seductive promise that complex political problems have simple military solutions. History is remarkably consistent on that point. Take care.